Gentlemen, as I said, you were the three lead reporters on the series, and the first thing I wanted to start off with, Justin, is that it struck me, you said that when we talked earlier that one of the catalysts of this series was a story about Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, that he had died in 2016 as a guest of a wealthy businessman on a ranch. I think it was in Texas. So take us, why was that the catalyst? Take it from there.
Yeah, and I want to apologize for my voice. I'm getting over losing my voice, but hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, so back in late 2022, Josh and I had been assigned to ProPublica's democracy team, and thankfully no one had really defined what democracy meant. So it was up to us to just find something that we could argue fit under that, under that heading. And originally, actually, we got interested in covering the judiciary. We thought that the judiciary more broadly, not the Supreme Court specifically, struck us as undercovered. And the original idea was actually to look at the appellate courts, the federal appellate courts, which get almost no coverage. But in the course of doing some preliminary reading, talking to experts, that sort of thing, we started to read about Justice Scalia's death back in 2016, and as folks may remember, it came out only because he happened to die on this trip, that he was at a private hunting estate in Texas owned by a businessman who had some business at the Supreme Court, actually seemed to be part of a 1,000-year-old European secret hunting society called the Society of Hibernius, I believe it was, where they have strange titles and wear green robes and that sort of thing. And so this had gotten some press at the time, of course, but struck us as interesting and raised the question of, who is getting access to these Supreme Court justices when they're not at the court, and including this question of travel. So we got interested in that, and what we realized pretty quickly is that the court is not subject to the public records law, and they release almost no information, basically no information actually, about what the justices do outside, yeah, exactly, outside of when they're actually having oral arguments. So we started poking around. I could keep going.
I want to get to you, Josh, because you'd also mentioned, I thought this phrase, you said that the way you got a lot of your initial information was by getting the Freedom of Information Act disclosure from the U.S. Marshals, and they could guard the Supreme Court justices to track their movements, which is a very narrow approach. But you had to take that narrow approach initially, right? Because there were not many alternatives.
Yes, I mean, this was the initial thing that got us started on this, and at that point we didn't know that this was going to become a story at all. But thinking about the kind of questions that Justin just outlined, we were trying to understand if there's any way that we could get records on this, and we learned that when the justices travel outside of DC, sometimes they get assistance from the U.S. Marshals, and they are part of the executive branch and thus are subject to FOIA. And so we were getting ready to file our own Freedom of Information Act request, but we learned that a little nonprofit had already requested and received about 2 years of records for all of the justices from the Marshals, and they posted them online. And it was about 2,500 words of records, 2,500 pages of records, and at first glance they just seemed so useless that we thought maybe no one's ever actually read all of these. And so we decided to sit down and with Alex went through all of them and kind of pulled out anything that seemed interesting, and kind of buried deep in there we saw this mention of a private jet, and it was one justice. These records were extraordinarily redacted. The names of the justices were redacted, the purposes of the trip were normally redacted, but one justice, unclear who, had gone from DC to New Haven and back on the same day on a private jet. And that struck us as potentially interesting, and we started trying to figure out more, and Alex found some information that made us think it was probably Clarence Thomas, and then we were able, with a little more digging, to figure out that the plane was Harlan Crow's.
Billionaire Harlan Crow,
Billionaire Harlan Crow.
the provider of the most gifts to
Yes.
Clarence Thomas.
And it was, we called around, and this flight would have cost, roughly $70,000 if Thomas had chartered the plane himself. And as you all know, getting from DC to New Haven's easy Amtrak route. So it felt kind of extraordinary to do that via a Texas billionaire's private plane. And so that got us thinking, well, maybe this is the sort of thing that you only do if you're in the habit of doing stuff like this.
You also saw your example, I think, of where Clarence Thomas took with Wayne Huizinga, another billionaire.
Right.
He provided transportation to him, went on was it a 737 jet? Brett?
Yeah, so I came.
That's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I came into I joined the band pretty late, and it was after these guys started receiving tips, and one of them was, a whisper of a relationship between Wayne Huizinga and Justice Thomas. If you guys remember Huizinga, he was the man behind Waste Management, Blockbuster, and AutoNation. I think the first American to bring 3 separate companies into Fortune 500. And eventually I found a flight attendant slash private cook who worked on one of Huizinga's 2 737s. He had 2. He had a fleet of aircraft parked in his private hangar in Fort Lauderdale. And he pretty frequently, for a lot of his friends, including Justice Thomas, would send one of his 737s up to Washington to pick him up and bring him back down to Florida. And they would go to sporting events and stuff like that.
One thing that strikes me is that you had, to start off with this, Justin, you had 10 or more reporters involved in this, although you were the primary reporters, the 4 of you, over a great deal of 2023.
Mm-hmm.
How did you organize it? How did you organize the reporting of a project this massive?
Yeah, well, as Josh said, and I'm sure many reporters in the room understand, we we did not set out at the end of 2022 thinking we're going to spend 14 months looking at relationships and travel with Supreme Court justices. It really sort of unfolded organically, and what happened was we, as Josh was saying, we got onto this this first flight that we identified where Harlan Crow had flown Justice Thomas to New Haven and back. We learned much later the purpose of that flight, by the way, was Crow had also paid like $200,000 to have a portrait painted of Thomas that was going to hang at Yale Law School. And the entire purpose of this flight back and forth that day was to, so Justice Thomas could get a tour of the room at Yale where this was going to hang. That ended up being what that was for. But, what happened was we ended up spending around 3 months, Josh, Alex, and I, digging into this Crow-Thomas relationship and the travel. We're able to establish that Crow was basically subsidizing, or he was subsidizing, Thomas's vacations for more than 20 years. And, we published that story, I guess last April, and as the reporters here know, you never really know whether a story's gonna land. It's hard to predict. But in this case, it got a lot of attention, and we started to just get a flood of tips, many of which were wrong and ended up being dead ends, but some of which were meaty leads that led to other gifts that Crow and then other billionaires to provide Thomas, paying for private school tuition, an undisclosed real estate purchase, and so. To answer your question, it was kind of drinking from a fire hose. We brought Brett onto the team, who started chasing several tips at the same time we were. Alex was working on all the stories.
Did you meet every day, like 5 o'clock, and compare notes, or once a week?
Justin and I were on the phone most of the hours of the day, just kind of constantly, and then we constantly talk with each other, I think.
Yeah, I can actually fill in some color on this.
Please don't.
The 2 of them, so I would often find in the office, I'm glad I have an opportunity to tell this. I would often find one of them in the office alone, and it was interesting because they would have like headphones in, and I thought maybe they were listening to something, but even when they weren't speaking to one another, they were just doing chores or tasks, they would be on the phone with one another, just talking about what it was they wanted to do for reporting that day, or like as they were, you know, putting toast in the toaster in the office kitchen, they were just constantly on the phone with one another. I was sort of on my own. I worked with Alex and another researcher pretty often, but it was something to behold these two working in lockstep with one another every day.
One thing striking you told me earlier was that, I think of most investigative stories depend heavily on documentation, either in paper and also from the web. But Justin, you had mentioned that 80% of the reporting that went into this series was from human sources, which I think is rather remarkable. Why was that necessary to get most of the reporting from human sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the lack of public records when it comes to the court. I mean, when you're covering Congress or the executive branch, like the bread and butter of that reporting are things like campaign finance records, lobbying records, public calendars of executive branch officials. None of that exists for the court. And so all of this was really kind of like a jigsaw puzzle and based on, hundreds of cold calls to people, probably the biggest broad category was the service workers who were, serving the meals on Harlan Crow's yacht. Brett mentioned flight attendants on private jets, Alaska fishing guides. That was actually for a story about Justice Alito. And so, we were putting together spreadsheets, just calling people, and, we always joke that it's sort of good experience for dating in New York because people are just constantly telling you no. That's like 95% of the people. But it helps to have a partner doing this because, at least for me personally, if I'm doing this on my own and the last 9 people I called are hanging up at me or telling me off, or there starts to be sort of a spiral of self-doubt and self-loathing. It helps if there's another person who can tell you you're not worthless.
You're a good guy. You're a good guy. But you documented 38 trips. Those are the ones you said that you know about.
This was Brett, actually.
Right, but
I'm still not sure it's true.
The Clarence Thomas trip. But the fact is that to say that each was a trip, transport paid for, you had to nail all that down. Most of that was human sources. That's just remarkable. That's amazing amount of double checking and triple checking.
Well,
I'm sure it was hard.
As Justin was saying, with luxury travel, there is no, one of the kind of products of if you travel on a private jet or on a yacht or at a resort where you can't really otherwise get access, is discretion. And so there are lots of non-disclosure agreements surrounding all of these trips and things like that. But the kind of one of our early realizations was that if you're going to travel like in that level of luxury, like a Billionaire, you can't really have total privacy because there's so many staff involved in every trip. And so it was just, even Crow's Private Resort had a staff of 30 people who cleaned the beds and cooked the food and served the milkshakes from the 1950s style soda shop. And all of those people were able to tell us, oh yes, Clarence Thomas was there that year.
But did he get them to sign? Maybe he has it now, but Harlan Crow, I bet those people had to sign agreements not to say anything.
Oh yeah, they had. Yeah.
So they had signed agreements to keep main private, and they still talk to you.
Some.
Sizable handful.
One thing I wanted to mention, you could comment on it, Brett, is that I tend to think when I see most investigative stories, there are huge blocks of text. There's financial, there are all kinds of charts. It's hard to keep track of what's going where, more generic photos. You had fantastic photos in this series. I say really a picture is 1,000 words. One of them was Justice Samuel Alito, salmon fishing in Alaska, next to billionaire hedge fund manager Paul Singer holding up their fish proudly. That's one picture. Another one is a photo of Justice Thomas stoking, smoking a cigar, sitting in a chair surrounded by his sycophants, including Harlan Crow, in the Adirondacks, okay? Beautiful photo. Another one is a photo of Justice Thomas at a Nebraska football game where he frequently got free tickets to the boxes. And what I want to ask you is, Where did you get those photos?
The first two are these guys. The last one I can comment on is the football game. The nice thing about some of this reporting, in addition to the human sources we were using to substantiate everything, was a compulsion for those around them to post on social media. And a lot of the trips we saw on the back end were folks who were in the room, in the skybox at the football game, for example, or on the jet, taking a picture, and it might have been someone's, nephew or grandson or someone's friend, and they would upload the picture, and someone would have access because they were, Facebook friends with someone else to that individual picture. And some of them came in as tips, some of them we heard about that we went to go try to find in order to triangulate, who was in this spot at this different time. There was one example I had to run down is we had this picture of Justice Thomas whitewater rafting.
I didn't see that one.
Yeah, it was in there. I think it was in there. It was somewhere on Snake River in Wyoming, by the Tetons, and we saw, Alex and I, we saw that they had this it was a very specific looking life jacket that they were wearing. So we were like, it feels like only so many guys would use that kind of life jacket. So we went trolling through all the dude ranches and private rafting tour companies' website for a jacket that kind of looked like that, narrowed it down to a dozen or so, and then we just started calling each individual company and said, do you mind looking through your invoices on this date range? For this person, we think David Sokol was the host. He was Warren Buffett's former heir apparent at Berkshire. He probably would look in your records like this. Do you mind confirming it for us? And eventually we found the company that confirmed the dates and the passengers, so we could tie it all together in the story as one anecdote.
I'm sure if you interviewed somebody though and you knew their name and they told you generically about an event, you could also just cross-check their LinkedIn or Facebook account as well, available to the public to see if.
Sometimes, but a lot of times the stuff was not public. So like that example we were like pretty much asking to go into your records and help us tie this thing down, and surprisingly a lot of folks were willing to help us out.
Did you realize how important the pictures would be when you started out?
Justin could probably speak more about that. You guys.
I'm not sure when we started out, but it became, as you say, I mean, I like to think I'm a pretty talented prose stylist, but I don't think, but I don't think any description I could come up with would land the sort of have the punch of a picture of a justice holding like a 80-pound salmon next to a hedge fund manager who had cases at the Supreme Court. So it was pretty clear that was going to be an important part of the story. I mean, I guess one piece of context, just so everyone understands, is that the reason all this travel mattered ultimately. I mean, several reasons, but one was questions of influence and access, but also the Supreme Court has very few ethics rules, but there is one law, at least where there's one important law that was passed back in the 70s that does apply to Supreme Court justices, which says that if they accept gifts over several $100s, they have to disclose them. It's supposed to be out in the open so everyone can see, who's applying them with gifts. And basically everything we're talking about here were gifts that were above the threshold, which is like $400 or so, that were not disclosed, which is a violation of this ethics law.
Yeah, I think that law also was after Watergate, right?
Yeah, it was passed after Watergate, and it applies to many government officials, including but not limited to Supreme Court justices.
One thing, maybe Josh, you can address is that the folks said that you worked, as all investigative reporters do, but you worked especially closely with the lawyers. But the key thing you worked very closely with one was the issue of the definition of disclosure. Legal disclosure. What is legal required disclosure and the guidelines of disclosure by the Supreme Court? Could you expand on that? Why that was so important?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think when we set out on this, we were anticipating that we'd be having arguments about the law with Supreme Court justices. So once we got into that stage and we were saying Clarence Thomas appears to have broken the law, ProPublica's lawyers wanted to get in the weeds and make sure we knew what we were talking about. But I mean, from like a legal vetting perspective, these stories were not that complicated in the sense that none of the facts were ever in dispute. No one, neither Thomas or Alito or the billionaires giving them things ever said that these gifts didn't happen. They just said that it was fine. And there was an argument about whether or not they had to be disclosed under the law, and we tried pretty hard to find someone who is an expert in the disclosure law, the Ethics in Government Act, which there's a lot of people who, because this is taken so seriously in the executive branch and in Congress, there are a lot of people who made careers out of interpreting this law, and everyone we spoke to said that this was a no-brainer. The law clearly, very required that all of these gifts be disclosed.
Anybody like to expand on that? Huh?
No, Josh, I think hit it. The gifts, the rules on what they can accept, as you were saying, is a little fungible and harder to nail down. There's more debate about it, and there's less, stringent rules about that. But the disclosure is what we really chose to kind of nail down on, because according to the experts we talked to, those were the most flagrant violations that we had found.
And also, right, it was a harder, it was also, you went firmer ground, I think, if you dealt with undisclosed travel in a jet or a helicopter on a boat, as opposed to accepting a gift of hospitality to somebody's home. Where theoretically, Harlan Crow could argue that some of these areas were his home.
Right, there's a
little fuzzier.
There's a carve out in the law, and if you want to read thousands and thousands of words on this, we can direct you to some content. But there's a carve out in the law that, which I think everyone probably would agree makes sense, that if your close friend has you over for a fancy dinner, even if it costs a lot of money, like, you don't have to disclose that. It's just like dinner. But that very clearly, that carve out very clearly does not apply to transportation. As Josh said, I don't know if anyone here is, in the practice of chartering private jets, but it's extraordinarily expensive. I mean, again, like this New Haven round trip, DC to New Haven, $60,000 or $70,000, and so there's no good argument that did not have to be disclosed. We found a lot of examples of other lower court judges disclosing this sort of thing, and so that was one key issue.
Okay, good. One thing I wanted to ask was that we've got lots of younger investigative reporters here, even senior. We're going to be watching the video version of this panel tomorrow, or the future in the ethersphere. And I wanted to ask you, start off with you, Justin, and then go with each of you. How was the Supreme Court series in terms of your investigative reporting, your experience, different from other investigative stories you've done?
Yeah, I mean, it was somewhat different in that this was a particularly kind of closed and cloistered institution. Again, no public records. There's obviously a culture of sort of secrecy and discretion. Other things that the story intersected with, like the Bohemian Grove, which is this all men's retreat in Northern California, also is incredibly secretive. So there's that aspect, but honestly, I think the kind of tools investigative reporting are pretty much universal depending on the topic. It's really just about seeing what documents you can get and talking to people that other people aren't talking to. That's kind of it.
Because let's talk about there. Are there any tools that you felt, lessons you learned from doing this story, Josh, that you're going to take to other stories?
That's a good question. I mean, as Justin said, I think it's similar kind of to what you do with any investigation. But I mean, I guess in this case, is kind of an extreme example of trying to come up with as many ways as we possibly could of getting at the kind of core facts we're looking at, which is these relationships between these justices and these billionaires. And so sometimes that was really getting to understand the nitty gritty of the luxury yacht industry, and sometimes that was talking to portrait painters and scuba diving instructors, and most of these cases, like, we had no idea these people were going to be useful when we started calling them, and there were a lot of other ridiculous routes we tried that didn't pay any dividends at all.
Like what?
That's one that didn't work.
We can't talk about all of them because some of it's about stories we
That's
couldn't
okay.
confirm.
You
Some
know,
of it's about
anything you
stories
talk
we
about.
couldn't confirm. Alex?
There are people you would think might have known or seen something, and they often don't. You spend a lot of time, one, trying to find out who those people are, finding out their phone number, then eventually getting them on the phone. And that can be weeks of work for just one person you're really hopeful would be in a position to know something. And often they don't. They don't know the thing you thought they would know, and they don't know anybody who would know the thing that you want them to know. And
You mean they're useless?
well, they're very generous with their time, and they talk to us on the phone, and that's nice of them. But yeah, I mean, for the story, they can't bring a whole lot. What was different for me in this story is I had built most of my career on public records. Even when I've been writing on private sector, I would look for ways in which industry would intersect with some government agency that might have some regulatory record, a complaint, an HR complaint, maybe that's a lawsuit, whatever it is, state agencies, federal agencies. I found back doors and side doors into companies or insular institutions, usually through public records with a mix of sourcing too. The public records were just kind of out on this entirely. So that made the sourcing component that much more important. And just like as these guys were saying, you can't really get discouraged by those 9 people who tell you no, because the 10th person, or sometimes the 100th out of 100 will know that thing, and you have to go to them. You can't really give up. You got to knock on their doors. A lot of door knocking in this series, more than I had done in previous. The phone doesn't always work. Sometimes people are more receptive to someone on their porch than they are over the phone.
Because you said, Justin, if you've been dating in New York, you won't be put off by that process, Anyway, I wonder if anybody has some questions here in the audience. We'll just go each one of whatever you want. First, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering about the service workers don't have a lot of power in this situation. So like, how did you get them to trust you, and are they okay now?
What's the question?
Yeah, what's the
Sorry. So the service workers, I'm wondering how they got them to trust them, and then if the service workers are okay now after the stories have been published.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, and it was a process. We got to know people over the course sometimes of months, and tried to be extraordinarily transparent with them.
Was it strictly by phone, or did you go to some of these destinations and meet them face to face?
We did a lot of face-to-face reporting. Unfortunately, none of it was at any of these destinations. We managed to spend a year reporting on some of the most beautiful places in the world without going to any of them. But we did go to where a lot of these people lived, which was
Random states.
Random states in the lower 48. But yeah, I mean, and everyone's fine. We have not had anyone have their identity be compromised, and we were just trying to be extremely deliberate about how to protect that anonymity.
When you mentioned meeting people in person versus on the phone or otherwise, that's a huge difference, right? In terms of the quality of the reporting.
I found so, and I know these guys have had similar experiences with folks on their front porch and at their front door, walking them through what it is we're doing and how they might be able to help, and the steps we'll take to protect their anonymity, and why their name isn't important, but something that they saw that they can help us corroborate or substantiate is very important. And leaving the door open, a lot of folks might say no in that moment, but they might think about it and call you later. And the fact that I think I can speak for all 3 of us, have never in our career burned a source goes a long way. So when you're able to tell people that your word is your currency, and all of our reputations have stood on stories like this, and on protecting our sources, our anonymous sources, that goes a long way with folks. And we bring them into the process. We say we'll talk with you as we're going. We'll let you know what we find out, how it jives with what you told us. We'll give you a call back before we publish. We can go over it all together. That goes a long way with building trust with people. So it's not entirely extractive. You bring them into the process of reporting.
Another question.
So I have 2, if that's okay. One is, I wondered if these people that you spoke to if you felt they had a sense that this was wrong, there was something wrong that was going on. I also wondered about what you felt about the reaction to the story after it was published.
I'm not sure you understood your first question, that was,
Whether
you wondered if the
whether
justice
the
understood
service
something was going.
people had a sense that this was wrong, or they had never thought about it until you started asking questions about it.
Yeah, did people hear that?
No.
Oh,
No, okay. I can
I'm
repeat
sorry.
it. I can repeat it. No.
Please, yeah.
The first question was, did the service workers who were speaking to have a sense that what we were writing about was wrong or might be wrong? So that, you know, like any reporting, people have different motivations, and we kind of have to take what we can get. And the most important thing is obviously just that the information is true, and if somebody has an axe to grind, then you want to know that so you can kind of discount accordingly. And obviously we're not doing things off of single anonymous sources, but yeah, I mean, in many cases the answer is yes. I mean, I think when we were pursuing this story about Justice Alito and Paul Singer, you know, the the trip that Singer helped pay for, that this luxury Alaska fishing trip that Alito went on, Paul Singer's hedge fund, Elliott Management, had a series of cases at the Supreme Court, both before and after, not full, in some cases not full-blown cases, but petitions, in some cases at the court, both before and after that trip. And I think that people, at least some of the people we spoke to, understood that, you know, if you found yourself in a legal dispute with somebody, you would want to know if the judge was vacationing with the person opposite you. There's something that just obviously, setting aside what if the rules and technical recusal standards, I think a lot of people, it doesn't really sit right with them. And so I don't think that wasn't really a hard pitch to make. Yeah.
Michael?
And just a follow-up to this, to the previous question, and another question for myself. Do you feel you benefited from like the partisan like environment around the court? Like, I'm practically asking if like some people were more willing to speak out because they're Democrats versus others were more unwilling to actually speak out because they're Republicans. And besides that, you describe the Supreme Court as a secretive institution, which I understand why, given the lack of like public disclosures. But at the same time, they were doing many of these things in plain sight. And DC sometimes can be an insular environment, like gossipy. Like, are you surprised a bit that you were the first to that story and no one else before had actually touched on these relations? Because they were out in the open.
Yeah.
I could take the second one first. We were surprised how much people didn't know about this. Like, even once we were getting, like, because I think when we first set out on this, we'd be like, oh, the clerks will know. The Supreme Court clerks will know. And they did. Like, we eventually were talking to clerks, and they just genuinely had, they were like, oh, I know the justice was out of town that week. I had no idea what they were doing. And so, and most of these trips, there were some that made it onto social media, but in most cases, I mean, we were like Harlan Crow's family, for instance, extremely active social media posters. Anytime they were on vacation with Thomas was not in a single picture. So there was a level, it seemed, at least, of care to prevent this from being public. And so, I mean, I think, we went into this with no sources, which felt like a disadvantage, because it probably was, but it like meant that we had to go at it from people outside of Washington, and I think that's kind of what got us, why we stumbled across all this.
And on the
One
partisan,
last-
The
Oh,
first
sorry,
question.
You're next, and then Larry, okay?
Yeah, I was gonna say, how long did it take you all to complete this, kind of from the original tip, brainstorming phases to the actual editing? And at what point did you decide, did you all decide we have enough to write the story?
So, as I was saying earlier, we started off looking at we started off in the kind of terrifying phase that all the reporters here understand, which is just staring at a blank screen, being like, what the hell are we gonna do next year? and looking at several things in the judiciary. After we found that first flight, we actually considered writing a story just about this single private jet flight, even though we had no idea what it was about, what it was for. And so we went to our editors and said, should we write a quick story about this, see what this shakes loose? And they, in their infinite wisdom, our brilliant editors said, no, you should spend a few weeks looking into this more and seeing if there's something more here. And then had a few reporting breaks in those few weeks that made it clear that it was probably worth sinking some more time into. And I think we ended up spending about 3 months, Josh, Alex, and I, maybe 3.5 months on the first story, which was about the travel that Crow was providing Thomas. And we then, after that got a lot of attention, we got a lot of tips, and so we were able to do a couple of quicker stories based on those tips that were easier to confirm. But we ended up working on this for like the entire year, and some of the subsequent stories also took months.
Larry?
I have 2 questions. One, what was the response when you called the justices of the court to verify and fact check? How did they respond to it?
To the Alito.
Well, so Thomas, we had this fun little dance we would do with Thomas, where we would, before every story, send him, spend a lot of time crafting a very long, detailed summary of every fact that we were planning on reporting, or the different trips that we were planning on summarizing, and then he would ignore it and never say. He just seems to have a policy of never engaging with the press. He did release a statement after our first story came out, a brief statement. So we had no interaction with all other than confirming through the Supreme Court press office that he'd gotten it. And then Alito, with the Alito story, we similarly reached out for comment, and we got our first ever call from the Supreme Court press office. We were very excited about it, and they said they'd gotten it, and that I think they asked for a little more time to respond at first, or maybe they were asking if that might be possible. And eventually they said that Alito is not going to be commenting, but asked when the story was going to be running. And I think this was right around our deadline, and we said, definitely not today, but maybe as soon as tomorrow. And then a few hours later, Alito published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that we were misleading I think the headline was ProPublica misleads its readers.
On a story that hadn't published yet.
Yeah, which
very confusing.
But it was essentially responding to our questions in op-ed form, which was, I'm sure, confusing to any reader who had no idea what anyone was talking about. And so that was, we kind of scrambled that night. Our editors stayed up with us, and we, incorporating his responses, trying to get experts to weigh in on what Alito said, and published around midnight, and then never ever heard from the press office.
So the Supreme Court press office was willing to let Thomas hang? They just didn't care?
I think Thomas called the shots on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's opaque how it works there, but there's, semi-interestingly, there's actually only one. Each justice doesn't have their own PR person. There's one press office for the whole court. So you go through the press office, then what happens after that is opaque. I mean, presumably the questions get sent to the chambers of the relevant justice, and then our assumption is that justices call the shots. I mean, it has to be that. I mean, the press office probably is playing some kind of advisory.
Even the retired justices use that.
So in light of this being the impact award, what is the impact of the story been?
They adopted an ethics code, which is the first time in the court's history of having that. The lower courts had one, and it laid out a lot of similar things that they said they would abide by. That was I guess, a pretty crucial step in them at least acknowledging that there was public outcry over this. I think it was framed as they were, setting the record straight or fixing misconceptions in the public. It remains to be seen, how exactly that would be enforced. So a lot of the criticism of the code was that there was no enforcement mechanism baked into it. At the end of the day, it's a very separate branch, and who would enforce any alleged violation of the code is still an open question. And we reported on the internal systems that are already in place that they use to police themselves. We found that they're largely toothless and hapless, and kind of up to the individual judges to actually police themselves quite a bit. So
you said that they had a disclosure policy that they should have followed. What is the repercussion of not following that?
there's a law. I mean, the law that's on the books, the Ethics in Government Act that Justin was talking about, explicitly applies to justices. And if there is a violation, if there's credible evidence of a violation, then this internal body, this is one of the ways in which it can get elevated. There's an internal body called the Judicial Conference. It's made up of each chief judge of every circuit, is supposed to evaluate the allegation, and they're supposed to refer it to the AG if there is credible evidence of a willful violation of the Ethics in Government Act, even if it's a justice, apparently. That hasn't happened. There's ongoing discussions right now. There apparently still, that body, the Judicial Conference, is still vetting the most recent allegations born of our reporting, but we don't know where that stands or where it'll ultimately go.
By the way, I think another impact there, as you know, is that Scotus had to revise his own disclosures 1 year, which they almost never do. And also the articles prompted an investigation by the Senate Finance Committee into the way Harlan Crow, the billionaire, discloses travel as well. And also there's been a big debate, increasing debate about how billionaires or the wealthy accounts for business and personal, personal write-offs. And that's what they found with Crow is a real problem. But I wanted to get the lady in back.
Oh yeah. I wanted to ask about just like identifying the justices on the trips, like when you're calling the different like service workers, like some of these people aren't necessarily public figures, or like you wouldn't know what Paul Singer looks like, or the hedge fund guy and the justices necessarily. So how did you kind of make sure that they were identifying the right person?
Yeah, it's a good point, and in fact, sometimes people misremembered or thought that somebody was a justice who was not a justice, and vice versa. The gold standard obviously is having some kind of contemporaneous documentation, and that's why the photographs that sometimes were posted on social media, but sometimes were like on somebody's old digital camera or something that we were able to get were so key, because we could make sure that it was actually a Supreme Court justice. I mean, we were sort of trying everything we could. One thing we published was a worker on Harlan Crow's yacht had who we'd been talking to for a number of weeks thought they remembered Justice Thomas attending a cruise in New Zealand a number of years ago on this yacht, but wasn't really sure, wasn't 100% sure, didn't have pictures of it, and we were, one person's memory is not enough to go with that, especially when Thomas was not engaging with us. But we had a breakthrough on that when this person remembered that when the week or two long trip was over, Thomas gave this worker a tip, but instead of money, Thomas gave this person a copy of his memoir signed, which is not really a good move. But the person ended up being able to dig out the memoir, and we published a picture of it in which Thomas says, "Thanks so much for your hard work on our New Zealand vacation." So that's how we got that one.
We have one last question.
I ask this question?
Oh, two last questions. Go ahead.
What do you think their own rationalization for this behavior is? Because I know that there's this sense that as a lawyer, you have the opportunity to make a lot of money, especially as a corporate law partner. You can make millions over your career. Is there a sense that they were owed it because of their public service? What's your theories about their own justification for this behavior?
I got a response from one of the beneficiaries, David Sokol, that summarized at least his thoughts on it. It's probably reflected by the others too. One, we're friends, like we're legitimate friends, and why is it such a big deal for two friends to hang out? Sometimes I host him, sometimes he hosts us. Yes, yeah, I have more money, my things are nicer, but friends. So what's the big deal? Two, he should be flying private because of security concerns. This is a justice. The implication there seemed to be that the U.S. government wasn't doing enough. We didn't drill down a ton on that argument, but he was saying more or less all justices, including Justice Thomas, should fly private. I think Justice Alito made the argument in his pre-buttal in the Journal, is that some of you know where this is going. The seat on the private jet wasn't being used by anyone, so it was empty anyway.
Well, the plane was going anyway.
Yeah, the plane was going anyway. So
I used that one.
yeah, cool amongst us. So those were some of the arguments, but it seemed to be the crux of it, and I think Crow said something similar, was like, dear friends, like we're actually friends. We're not looking to get anything out of this. And Justice Thomas had said in Wayne Huizinga's wife's unpublished family memoir, which I got from a former caterer, he said, I go down there to visit with the Huizingas, and we just talk about the weather and sports and his family and dogs, and he doesn't want anything from me, I don't want anything from him. This is not extracted, this is true friendship. So I think that was the crux of it.
Except for the part about not recusing himself during the cases.
Right. I mean, and there's also a really big outstanding question around that too. I mean, this is their defense, but I mean, with Thomas in particular, there's something a very strange pattern of none of the people that we wrote about this entire year were their friends before they were Supreme Court justices. These weren't their college roommates. In every case, they met for the first time well after they were on the court. And Thomas had this kind of stunning pattern of sometimes he would meet a guy at a truck stop, a small business, a medium-sized businessman, and then the next year the man would be giving him $5,000 to help with his kid's tuition. And how exactly, what sort of interaction leads to that jump happening is something we still don't know much about. We do know that Thomas, around when these gifts were starting, was trying to get more money. He was complaining to friends that he was underpaid, because an elite lawyer can make millions of dollars in the private sector annually. And in at least one case, threatened to a congressperson, essentially, that if our salaries on the court don't go up, I might, or justices might resign, kind of implying that he might step down imminently. But is that the kind of master explanation? We still don't really know.
Carolyn, last question.
Yes. So far you've mentioned Thomas and Alito several times. Was this a sort of thing that a lot of different justices seem to have engaged in this practice, but you couldn't verify it, or were there some names that just never came up at all?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, as we were describing earlier, when we started with the U.S. Marshals records, the justices' names weren't even on there. So we were looking, we were initially looking at private jet references and landed on this Thomas trip. I mean, so Justice Breyer, now off the court, and the late Justice Ginsburg did a fair amount of international travel on other people's dime. Breyer was on the Pritzker Prize architecture, the jury for the Pritzker Prize, a major architecture prize, which involved being flown around the world to look at the Sydney Opera House or whatever. Now the reason, there's several reasons that's different, but the kind of most relevant one here is the reason we know about that is that it was all disclosed. It was on the forms. Whereas everything we were writing about was happening in secret. Also, we've been talking a lot about travel, but Thomas also had around $100,000 of private school tuition paid for his relative that he was raising as a child, undisclosed real estate transactions. Crow is his Justice Thomas's mother's landlord seems to be letting her live rent-free and paying for improvements on her house. So this is far beyond just vacationing together. We did get tips and pursue leads about other justices, all of which, or most of which, fizzled. So as far as what we know right now, Thomas is just a major outlier when it comes to this sort of thing, but it's possible that we don't know what the other justices are doing because these things are hard to figure out.
And we continue to be solicitous of more information about all the justices.
Yeah.
Because really the series is continuing if you get more stories,
Of
right?
course.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for those fantastic insights into a superb series, and congratulations on the award for coming tonight.